Rich lady splashes mud on cleaner girl, unaware who was watching. The morning rain had this way of making everything look smaller, sadder, like the world was crying and trying to wash itself clean, but the dirt just wouldn't come off. Eliza Santos pulled her worn cleaning jumpsuit tighter around her throat and stepped off the city bus into another gray Tuesday. 23 years old, but her hands already looked older, cracked from chemicals, calloused from scrubbing. The kind of hands that told stories no one wanted to hear. She'd been riding this same bus for 6 months now. Route 47. Always caught it at 5:47 a.m. Always sat in the third seat from the back where the vinyl was torn just enough to catch her jacket. The other passengers were like her, invisible people heading to clean up after visible ones. The Blackstone Tower loomed ahead through the drizzle. 47 floors of polished steel and glass, reaching up toward a sky that never seemed to reach back. This wasn't just any building. This was the building. The kind of place where decisions got made that changed people's lives 3 states away. Where handshakes happened over coffee that cost more than Eliza made in a day. And somewhere up there, behind those gleaming windows, people who'd never touched a mop made rules about people who lived with one in their hands. Eliza's shoes, secondhand Converses with duct tape holding the sole together, squished through puddles as she crossed the courtyard. The marble beneath her feet was the kind of pristine white that showed every scuff, every drop of rain, every reminder that the world wasn't as clean as it pretended to be. She'd learned to walk quietly here. Head down, eyes forward. Don't make eye contact. Don't draw attention. Don't remind the beautiful people that someone had to scrub away their messes while they slept in beds that cost more than most people's cars. The night shift was her world now. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., when the building belonged to people like her. When she could move through those marble halls without feeling like she was trespassing on someone else's dream. When the only sounds were the hum of floor buffers and the whisper of rags against glass. But this morning was different. This morning, she was running late because her little brother had thrown up all over the bathroom floor, and their mom was pulling double shifts at the diner, and someone had to clean it up, and someone had to make sure he got medicine, and someone had to be the grown-up when there weren't enough grown-ups to go around. That's when she heard it. The sound of an engine. Not just any engine. The deep, throaty purr of something expensive. Something that cost more than her family's rent for 2 years. A black BMW. Not just black, obsidian. The kind of black that seemed to swallow light instead of reflecting it. Sitting there in the executive parking area like a sleeping predator. Eliza didn't look up. She'd learned not to look at cars like that. They belonged to people who lived in a different universe, where money was just numbers on a screen and problems got solved with phone calls to people who solved problems for a living. But as she walked past, something happened that would change everything. The engine revved. Not accidentally. Deliberately. Like someone testing the power, feeling the machine respond to their touch. Then it happened. The BMW lurched forward through the puddle beside the curb. Not fast. That would have been an accident. Slow enough to be intentional. Controlled. Precise. The wave of dirty water hit Eliza like a cold slap across her legs and stomach, soaking through her uniform, through her skin, through something deeper than cloth and flesh. She stood there, frozen, water dripping from her chin, the taste of city rain and parking lot grime in her mouth. Her uniform, the only one she owned, now stained with mud and humiliation. Through the tinted windows of the BMW, she could see a figure. White coat, designer sunglasses, a flash of perfectly styled blonde hair. And then she heard it. Laughter. Not the kind of laughter that bubbles up when something's genuinely funny. The other kind. The kind that cuts. The kind that says, "You're not even real enough to matter." The woman in the white coat, Claire Moreau, though Eliza didn't know her name yet, tilted her head back and laughed like she'd just witnessed the most delightful accident. Like watching someone slip on a banana peel in an old movie. Except this wasn't an accident. And Eliza wasn't acting. Claire adjusted her rearview mirror, not to check for traffic, but to get one more look. To savor the moment. The way her perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the steering wheel suggested this wasn't her first time playing this particular game. Then, with the casual indifference of someone discarding a used tissue, Claire drove away. The BMW purred into the executive parking entrance, disappearing behind glass doors that required key cards and recognition and all the things that separated the people who mattered from the people who cleaned up after them. No apology. No acknowledgement. No recognition that what had just happened was anything more than a minor amusement in her perfectly curated morning. Eliza stood there in the rain, water still dripping from her uniform, and felt something crack inside her chest. Not break. Breaking would have been cleaner. This was more like a hairline fracture in a window, still holding together, but forever changed. She'd felt invisible before, but this was different. This was being seen just long enough to be dismissed, to be used as entertainment, to be reminded that some people's joy came from other people's pain. But what Eliza didn't know, what she couldn't see through the rain and her own reflection in the puddle at her feet, was that someone else had been watching too. 47 floors above, behind floor-to-ceiling windows that cost more than most people's houses, Joe Whitman stood with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. Joe wasn't supposed to be there. The CEO of Whitman Industries usually rolled in around 9, after his personal trainer and his custom breakfast, and his briefing with assistants who briefed him on what other assistants thought he needed to know. But today was different. Today, he'd woken up at 4 a.m. with that restless energy that came from having too much money and not enough meaning. So he'd driven in early, made his own coffee in the executive break room, burnt because he'd forgotten how normal coffee makers worked, and stood by the window watching the city wake up below. He'd been thinking about his father, about the stories the old man used to tell about starting with nothing, building something, leaving something behind that mattered, about how money was supposed to be a tool, not a trophy. That's when he saw her, the young woman in the cleaning uniform, walking across the courtyard with her head down and her shoulders set against the rain. He didn't know her name yet. Didn't know that she sent half her paycheck home to help with her brother's medical bills. Didn't know that she'd been valedictorian of her high school class, but couldn't afford college. Didn't know that she read library books on her lunch breaks and dreamed of things she'd never spoken out loud. All he knew was that she looked small down there. Not small like weak. Small like the world was too big and too hard, and she was carrying more than her share of it. And then he watched the BMW slow down. Watched the deliberate splash. Watched a young woman get soaked in dirty water for someone else's entertainment. Joe had seen a lot of things from that window. Protests and celebrations, accidents and arguments, the daily theater of a city full of people trying to make their way through another day. But this was different. This hit him somewhere he'd forgotten he had feelings. Maybe it was because he remembered being looked down on. Back when his father's construction company was just a beat-up truck and a dream. When he wore hand-me-down clothes to school and pretended not to notice the other kids' sneers. Maybe it was because he'd become the kind of person his younger self would have been afraid of. The kind who lived so far above the ground that other people looked like ants. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just one human being recognizing another human being's pain and realizing he had the power to do something about it. Joe watched Eliza stand there in the rain, water dripping from her uniform, and something shifted in his chest. Something that had been sleeping for too long woke up and stretched and decided it was tired of being ignored. He didn't know the cleaner's name yet. Didn't know her story or her dreams or the weight she carried home every night. But he knew this. Her story wasn't going to end in that puddle. Because the man who owned the building had just decided that some stories were worth rewriting. And sometimes, when you have enough power to change someone's life, the only question that matters is whether you have enough heart to try. Down in the courtyard, Eliza picked up her cleaning supplies and walked toward the building. She didn't cry. Tears were a luxury she'd learned she couldn't afford. She just walked, one wet step at a time, toward another day of being invisible. She had no idea that 47 floors above her, someone was seeing her for the first time. Really seeing her. And that changes everything. Some moments are designed to disappear. They happen, they hurt, and then they get buried under the weight of everything else that needs your attention. The splash in the parking lot should have been one of those moments. Should have been. But Joe Whitman couldn't shake it. Couldn't stop seeing that young woman standing there in the rain, water dripping from her uniform while someone drove away laughing. It played in his head like a song stuck on repeat, the kind that gets louder the more you try to ignore it. By lunch, he'd made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew him. Joe Whitman, CEO of a Fortune 500 company, called down to HR with a request that made his assistant Rosa raise an eyebrow, so high it practically touched her hairline. "I need a report on our janitorial staff," he said. Rosa had been working for Joe for 15 years. She'd seen him make billion-dollar decisions over breakfast and forget his own birthday 3 years running. But asking about the cleaning crew? That was new. All of them, Mr. Whitman? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. Start with the night shift, Joe said. I want to know who they are. Rosa was 62 years old and had worked her way up from secretary to executive assistant to the closest thing Joe had to a conscience. She'd learned to read between his lines, to hear the things he didn't say, to know when his business decisions were about more than business. This felt like more. I'll have that for you this afternoon, she said. The files were thin. Night shift workers always were. Hired quickly, paid quietly, expected to vanish by morning like they'd never been there at all. Eliza Santos, age 23, hired 6 months ago. Perfect attendance. No complaints. No commendations either, but that wasn't unusual. You didn't get gold stars for being invisible. Joe stared at the sparse details of her life reduced to bullet points on company letterhead. High school graduate. Previous job at a grocery store. Emergency contact. Maria Santos. Relationship. Mother. It was what the file didn't say that bothered him. No college listed. No career goals section. No trajectory beyond showing up and doing what needed to be done and collecting a paycheck that probably didn't stretch far enough. The kind of file that belonged to someone who'd learned not to expect too much from life. That afternoon, Claire breezed into his office like she owned it. Which, in a way, she thought she did. Claire Moreau had been Joe's girlfriend for 8 months now, long enough to have her own keycard, short enough that she still felt like she was auditioning for something bigger. She was beautiful in the way that required constant maintenance. Personal trainers and nutritionists and stylists who crafted her look like architects designing a building. I got the dress for your gala, she announced, dropping shopping bags on his leather couch like she was marking territory. Wait until you see it. It's going to make every other woman there absolutely sick with jealousy. She spun around, modeling an outfit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Her perfume, something French and expensive that came in bottles too pretty to throw away, filled the room like fog. Joe smiled, but it felt forced. Something about the way she said it, sick with jealousy, sat wrong in his stomach. Like she thought other people's pain was a compliment to her success. That's great, he said, but his heart wasn't in it. Claire perched on the edge of his desk, her manicured fingers playing with his tie. You seem distracted today. What's wrong? How could he explain it? How do you tell someone that you can't stop thinking about a stranger in a parking lot? That you'd spent your lunch break staring at employment files instead of quarterly reports? Nothing, he said. Just work stuff. But it wasn't work stuff. It was people stuff. Human stuff. The kind of stuff that doesn't show up on balance sheets, but matters more than anything that does. That evening, Joe found himself staying late. Not because he had work to do, but because he wanted to see the night shift in action. Wanted to see the people who kept his building running while the rest of the world slept. He took the elevator down to the lobby around midnight, telling himself he was just checking security. But really, he was looking for her. Eliza was mopping the marble floors near the reception desk, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to work without being noticed. She had earbuds in, but Joe could tell she was aware of everything around her. The way her head lifted slightly when the elevator doors opened, the way she moved her cart out of the way before anyone asked. Joe watched her work and felt something twist in his chest. There was a precision to her movements, a care in the way she cleaned each section of floor. This wasn't just a job to her, it was pride. Even when no one was watching, even when it would have been easy to cut corners, she did it right. The elevator dinged behind him, and Joe turned to see someone else getting off. A man in an expensive suit who looked like he belonged on the executive floors, not wandering around at midnight. The man walked past Eliza without a glance, tracking wet footprints across the floor she'd just cleaned. He dropped a coffee cup in the general direction of a trash can, missed, and kept walking. Eliza stopped mopping, looked at the cup rolling across her clean floor, looked at the muddy footprints cutting through her work like scars. She didn't sigh, didn't curse, didn't show any of the frustration Joe could see building in her shoulders. She just started over. That's when Joe made his second decision of the day. The next morning, he called Rosa into his office. I want to meet with one of the night shift cleaners, he said. Eliza Santos. Set up a meeting. Rosa's other eyebrow joined the first one. A meeting? With a janitor? A cleaning inspection, Joe said quickly. I want to review the quality of work on the executive floors. Rosa had been around long enough to know when her boss was lying. but she'd also been around long enough to know when not to ask questions. "I'll arrange it," she said. But as she walked back to her desk, Rosa couldn't shake the feeling that Joe Whitman was about to do something that would surprise them all, including himself. The message reached Eliza during her lunch break the next day. A formal email from HR requesting her presence in the executive suite at 2 p.m. for a quality review meeting with senior management. Eliza read it 3 times, her hands shaking slightly. In 6 months of working at Blackstone Tower, she'd never been above the 15th floor. The executive levels were another world, a place where carpets were thick enough to muffle footsteps and artwork cost more than cars. She changed into her cleanest uniform, tied her hair back, and took the elevator up to the 47th floor with her heart hammering against her ribs. Rosa met her at the elevator with a smile that seemed genuine but careful. "Miss Santos, I'm Rosa Martinez, Mr. Whitman's assistant. He's ready to see you." The executive suite was everything Eliza had imagined and nothing she'd prepared for. Floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the city into a living painting. Furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. The kind of silence that only came from being far enough above the world that its noise couldn't reach you. And behind a desk that could have doubled as a small aircraft carrier sat Joe Whitman. Eliza had seen his picture in the company newsletter, but seeing him in person was different. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of face that suggested he'd learned to be serious about things that mattered. His suit probably cost more than she made in 3 months, but he wore it like it was just clothes. When he looked up and saw her, something flickered across his face. Recognition? Concern? She couldn't tell. "Miss Santos," he said, standing up. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit down." Eliza perched on the edge of the chair across from his desk, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Every instinct told her to make herself smaller, to take up less space, to remember her place. "I wanted to talk to you about your work," Joe said, and Eliza's heart sank. This was it. The complaint. The firing. The end of the job she needed more than her next breath. "I'm sorry if there's been a problem," she said quickly. "I can do better. I can work extra hours. I can." "There's no problem," Joe said gently. "Your work is excellent. That's not why you're here." Eliza blinked. "I don't understand." Joe leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "How long have you been working here?" 6 months, she said. "And before that?" "Grocery store. Bagging, stocking, whatever they needed." "College?" The question hit like a small knife. "No, sir. Couldn't afford it." Joe nodded like that made perfect sense, like it was just another fact instead of the dream that died a little more each day. "What would you do," he said slowly, "if money wasn't an issue? If you could do anything?" Eliza stared at him. In her world, questions like that were luxuries. Dangerous luxuries. The kind that made you want things you couldn't have. "I don't know," she said. But she did know. She knew she'd always loved learning, loved the way knowledge connected things, made the world make sense. She knew she'd read every book in the local library's career section, dreaming about degrees she couldn't afford in jobs that seemed as distant as the moon. She knew she wanted to matter, to build something, to be more than invisible. But you didn't say things like that to men in $40,000 suits. You kept those dreams locked away where they couldn't hurt anyone. Joe washed her face and saw all of it anyway. The careful walls, the buried hopes, the way she'd learned to make herself small enough to fit into other people's expectations. "Tell me about yesterday morning," he said quietly. "In the parking lot." Eliza's blood turned to ice water. "Sir." The splash. The BMW. "I saw what happened." Her cheeks burned. Of course he'd seen. Of course someone had witnessed her humiliation, and now it was going to cost her the only job she could get. "It was nothing," she said quickly. "Just an accident. I don't want to cause any trouble." "It wasn't an accident," Joe said. Eliza looked down at her hands. "People like her don't see people like me," she said so softly he almost missed it. The words hung in the air between them like a confession, like a wound that had been festering in silence. Joe felt something crack open in his chest. Not break. That would have been simpler. This was more like a door he'd kept locked for too long finally giving way. "What if that changed?" he said. Eliza looked up, confusion written across her face. "What if people started seeing you?" Joe continued. "Really seeing you? Would that scare you?" It was the kind of question that required honesty. The kind that stripped away all the careful politeness and left only truth. "Yes," Eliza whispered. Because then they'd expect me to be more than I am. Joe smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. Miss Santos, he said, I think you're already more than you know. When Eliza left his office 20 minutes later, she carried with her something she hadn't had when she walked in: possibility. It was terrifying and wonderful and fragile as spun glass. And Joe watched her go, knowing that he'd just set something in motion that couldn't be undone. Behind the mirrored doors of the executive suite, change was beginning to breathe. And sometimes, that's how the best stories start. Not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with one person seeing another person's worth and deciding to do something about it. Even when it means everything has to change. Especially then. Joe had expected a lot of things from his meeting with Eliza Santos. Maybe gratitude, maybe surprise, maybe even a little hope creeping into those careful brown eyes. What he hadn't expected was the way she shut down completely. It happened the moment he asked about the mud splash. 1 second she was sitting there, nervous but present, answering his questions about work and dreams with the kind of honesty that cut straight through corporate small talk. The next second, she was gone. Not physically. Her body was still in the chair across from his desk. But everything that made her her had retreated somewhere he couldn't reach. It wasn't important, she said, and her voice had gone flat. Empty. Like she was reading from a script she'd memorized a long time ago. Just mud. But Joe had seen it happen. Had watched that black BMW slow down deliberately. Had seen the splash that soaked her uniform and something deeper. Had witnessed the laughter that followed like salt in an open wound. It looked intentional, he pressed gently. Silence stretched between them like a held breath. Eliza stared at her hands. Those work-worn hands that told stories about early mornings and late nights and bills that came faster than paychecks. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft he had to lean forward to hear her. People like her don't see people like me. 7 words. That's all it took to crack something open in Joe's chest. Not she didn't see me. Not it was an accident. Not even some people are just mean. People like her don't see people like me. Like it was a law of physics. Like gravity or thermodynamics. Like the natural order of things that couldn't be changed any more than you could make water flow uphill. Joe leaned back in his chair, disturbed by the quiet acceptance in her voice. This wasn't anger. Anger would have been easier to work with. This was something worse. This was resignation. The kind that came from learning the same lesson over and over until it carved itself into your bones. What if that changed, he asked. Eliza looked up then, and for just a moment, he saw something flicker behind her eyes. Something that might have been hope, if hope hadn't learned to hide so well. It doesn't, she said simply. After she left, Joe sat in his office staring out at the city below, trying to understand the weight that had settled in his stomach. He'd built companies, negotiated deals worth millions, made decisions that affected thousands of jobs. He was used to problems with solutions, challenges with strategies, obstacles that could be overcome with enough money and determination. But this felt different. This felt personal in a way that made his expensive education and corner office feel suddenly useless. That night, he found himself in Rosa's office long after most of the building had emptied out. Rosa was still there, of course. She always was when Joe needed to talk through something that mattered. Rosa Martinez had been his assistant for 15 years, but she was more than that. She was the closest thing he had to family in this glass tower. The one person who remembered who he'd been before the money and power changed the way people looked at him. She was also the only person in the building who wasn't afraid to tell him when he was being an idiot. You look like someone who's seen a ghost, she said, not looking up from the reports she was reviewing. Joe slumped into the chair across from her desk, the same chair where Eliza had sat that afternoon, trying to make herself invisible. Rosa, he said, have you ever felt like you missed who someone really was? Rosa set down her pen and gave him the kind of look that said she'd been waiting for this conversation. Joe, she said carefully, people show us who they are every day, but we only believe them when it hurts enough. The words hit him like a diagnosis he'd been avoiding. Because suddenly, Joe was thinking about Claire, really thinking about her for the first time in months. How she'd laughed about making other women sick with jealousy. How she'd talked about the waitress at their favorite restaurant. That girl is so slow, she probably can't even count. How she'd rolled her eyes when Rosa had mentioned her granddaughter's graduation. Community college doesn't really count, does it? Little moments. Throwaway comments. The kind of casual cruelty that was easy to ignore when it wasn't aimed at you. But now, sitting in Rosa's office with the taste of Eliza's resigned acceptance still bitter in his mouth, those moments felt like breadcrumbs leading to something ugly. She insulted you once, didn't she? Joe said quietly. Claire, I remember now. Rosa's smile was sad and knowing. She asked if I'd finished high school. Said it so sweetly, like she was just curious. But her eyes. Rosa shook her head. Her eyes were laughing. Joe closed his eyes. Why didn't you tell me? Because you weren't ready to hear it, Rosa said. And because some lessons you have to learn yourself. Joe spent the next few days watching. Really watching. And what he saw made his stomach turn. Claire at lunch, snapping her fingers at the server like she was calling a dog. Excuse me, miss. This water has spots on the glass. Are you people even trying? Claire in the elevator, loudly discussing the help at her apartment building. I swear, some of these people act like cleaning is rocket science. It's literally just scrubbing. How hard can it be? Claire in his office, complaining about the new girl who'd started doing some cleaning on the executive floors. She doesn't belong up here, Joe. She makes everyone uncomfortable. Each incident was small. Individually, they could be explained away as bad days or thoughtless moments or just the casual blindness that came with privilege. But together, they painted a picture Joe didn't want to acknowledge. The woman he'd been dating for 8 months wasn't just careless with other people's feelings. She was deliberately cruel to anyone she saw as beneath her. And she enjoyed it. The worst part? He'd known. On some level, he'd always known. He'd just chosen not to see it because seeing it would have meant doing something about it. And doing something about it would have meant admitting that he'd become the kind of person who could love someone capable of casual cruelty. That realization hit him like a physical blow, because it meant he was complicit. Every time he'd stayed silent while Claire belittled a server or dismissed a cleaning person or made some comment about those people, he'd been choosing her comfort over their dignity. He'd been choosing to be the kind of person his younger self would have been ashamed of. 3 days after his conversation with Rosa, Joe made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find out who Claire Moreau really was. Not the version she performed for him. All smiles and designer clothes and perfectly calculated charm. The real Claire. The one who emerged when she thought no one important was watching. It didn't take long. He started by asking Rosa to compile complaints from staff. Unofficially, quietly, just conversations over coffee about how things were going. The stories came pouring out. Claire had made a housekeeper at Joe's building cry by demanding she re-clean his apartment 3 times, claiming it wasn't up to standard, when really she just wanted to establish dominance. She'd gotten a valet fired from their favorite restaurant by claiming he'd been inappropriate, when really he'd just failed to recognize her from previous visits. She'd humiliated Rosa's replacement during a vacation week, asking loudly if the temp agency sent anyone who actually graduated high school. Each story was a small cruelty. Each one was carefully calculated to remind someone of their place in the hierarchy Claire had built in her head. And each one made Joe feel sicker. But the story that broke something inside him came from the building's night security guard, Miguel. A quiet man in his 50s who'd been working there for 7 years without a single complaint. She came through last week around midnight, Miguel told Rosa during one of their coffee conversations. Said she'd forgotten something in Mr. Whitman's office. I had to escort her up. You know, protocol. Rosa nodded, encouraging him to continue. On the way down, we passed that girl. The one who cleans the executive floors now. Eliza, I think. She was mopping, minding her own business. And your boss's girlfriend. Miguel shook his head. She looked at that girl like she was something disgusting on the bottom of her shoe. What did she say? Rosa asked, though she already knew she didn't want to hear it. She said, I don't know why Joe insists on having people like that on the executive floors. It's not like they understand the value of what they're cleaning. Miguel's voice was quiet, but Rosa could hear the anger underneath. Then she laughed, like it was funny. Rosa felt something cold settle in her stomach. What did Eliza do? Nothing, Miguel said. Just kept mopping. But I saw her face. She heard every word. That night, Rosa stayed late until Joe came by her office. She told him about Miguel's story, watching his face as the implications sank in. Joe listened in silence, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. When Rosa finished, the silence stretched between them like a chasm. She knew, Joe said finally. Claire knew I'd been asking about Eliza. She knew I was paying attention, and she went out of her way to hurt her. Joe. She didn't just splash mud on a stranger in a parking lot. Joe continued, his voice getting harder. She hunted down someone she knew I cared about and made sure she knew exactly how worthless Claire thought she was. Rosa watched her boss transform before her eyes. The uncertain man who'd been questioning his choices was gone. In his place sat someone who'd finally seen clearly and didn't like what he saw. What are you going to do? Rosa asked. Joe looked out the window at the city lights twinkling 47 floors below. Somewhere down there, Eliza Santos was probably getting ready for another night shift, carrying the weight of Claire's words along with her mop and cleaning supplies. Somewhere else, Claire Moreau was probably getting ready for bed in silk pajamas that cost more than Eliza made in a week, never giving a thought to the damage she'd done. I'm going to fix this, Joe said quietly. But as he sat there in Rosa's office, surrounded by the comfortable trappings of his success, Joe realized something that chilled him to the bone. He'd spent so much time at the top of his tower that he'd forgotten what the view looked like from the ground. And now that he remembered, he wasn't sure he could live with the person he'd become. The stain Claire had left on his life wasn't visible like the mud on Eliza's uniform. But it was there, and it was spreading. And Joe Whitman was finally ready to do something about it. Change, Joe discovered, was a lot harder than giving orders. For 20 years, he'd been used to problems that could be solved with phone calls and budget approvals. Need a new supplier? Make some calls. Want to expand into a new market? Hire consultants. Company morale down? Bring in motivational speakers and pizza Fridays. But fixing what Claire had broken in Eliza Santos wasn't that kind of problem. You couldn't budget your way out of someone's learned helplessness. You couldn't strategize away the kind of resignation that came from years of being told you didn't matter. Still, Joe had to try something. The idea came to him during a sleepless night when he'd been pacing his penthouse apartment, replaying Miguel's story about Claire's cruelty. If Eliza had been invisible on the night shift, maybe what she needed was to be seen in the daylight. So Joe made a decision that had Rosa staring at him like he'd lost his mind. You want to do what? She asked, setting down her coffee cup with enough force to make it ring against the saucer. Reassign her, Joe said. Temporarily. A week shadowing the front desk receptionist. See how she handles a different kind of work. Rosa leaned back in her chair, studying his face. Joe, honey, that girl has been invisible for 6 months. You can't just drag her into the spotlight and expect her not to panic. She won't be in the spotlight, Joe said. She'll be learning, training, finding out what she's capable of. And what happens when she fails? Rosa asked quietly. Because she might, you know. Not because she's not smart enough, but because she's terrified. And when people are terrified, they don't perform well. Joe had considered that, had spent half the night considering it. Then we'll know, he said. And we'll try something else. Rosa sighed. You're going to break that girl's heart. Someone already did that, Joe said. I'm trying to put it back together. The next morning, Eliza Santos got a call from HR that made her hands shake so badly she had to set down her phone twice before she could answer it. Miss Santos, this is Jennifer from Human Resources. We'd like you to report to the main reception desk tomorrow at 9 a.m. for a special assignment. I don't understand, Eliza said. Did I do something wrong? Not at all. This is a development opportunity. You'll be shadowing our receptionist for a week, learning front desk operations. Ms. Martinez will be supervising. After Jennifer hung up, Eliza sat on her narrow bed in the apartment she shared with her mother and brother, staring at the phone like it might explode. A development opportunity. In 6 months of working at Blackstone Tower, no one had ever used those words about her. Development was for people with futures. Opportunities were for people who mattered. People like her just showed up, did their jobs, and tried not to get fired. Her mother found her there an hour later, still holding the phone. Mija, what's wrong? Maria Santos asked, settling onto the bed beside her daughter. You look like you've seen a ghost. They want me to work the front desk, Eliza said. That's wonderful. Mama, I don't know how to work a front desk. I don't know how to talk to important people. I don't know how to dress or act, Eliza's voice cracked. What if I mess it up? What if they fire me? Maria took her daughter's hands in her own, hands that were just as work-worn, just as honest. Listen to me, baby. You've been taking care of this family since you were 15 years old. You balanced our checkbook when I couldn't read the numbers. You talked to your brother's doctors when I was too scared. You negotiated with landlords and bill collectors and made miracles happen with $20 and determination. Eliza looked down at their joined hands. That's different, she whispered. That's family. These are, these are important people. Baby, Maria said, lifting Eliza's chin so their eyes met. You are important people. The next morning, Eliza stood outside the Blackstone Tower at 8:45 a.m., wearing the only dress she owned, a simple black one she'd bought for her high school graduation 3 years ago. It was clean and pressed, but it felt like wearing a costume to a play she didn't understand. Rosa Martinez was waiting for her in the lobby, and the warmth in her smile was the first thing that made Eliza's racing heart slow down. Good morning, sweetheart, Rosa said. Ready for your first day? I think so, Eliza lied. The reception desk at Blackstone Tower was like mission control for a spaceship. Multiple phone lines, a computer system that looked like it required an engineering degree, and a constant stream of people who all seemed to know exactly where they belonged. Sarah, the regular receptionist, was a woman in her 30s with the kind of calm competence that made everything look easy. The trick, Sarah explained as she walked Eliza through the basics, is to remember that everyone who walks through that door thinks their problem is the most important thing in the world. And you know what? They're right. It is the most important thing to them. For the first 2 hours, Eliza mostly watched Sarah juggle phone calls and visitors and delivery people with the grace of a conductor leading an orchestra. Watched her solve problems and provide information and make people feel heard and valued. It was beautiful in its way, like watching an artist work. Then Sarah went to lunch, and Eliza was on her own. The phone rang immediately. Blackstone Tower, this is... Eliza's voice caught. This is Eliza. How can I help you? I need to speak to Joe Whitman immediately. The voice on the other end snapped. This is regarding the Pemberton contract, and it's urgent. Eliza's mind went blank. She knew Mr. Whitman's name, of course, but she had no idea what the Pemberton contract was, or how urgent was urgent, or what she was supposed to do with this information. She said, and immediately hated herself for it. Let me check on that for you. She put the call on hold and looked around desperately. Rosa was nowhere to be seen. Sarah was at lunch. And Eliza Santos, who could balance her family's impossible budget and negotiate with bill collectors, suddenly couldn't remember how to transfer a phone call. The lobby doors opened, and 3 people in expensive suits walked in, clearly expecting someone to greet them immediately. The phone rang again. And again. Eliza felt panic rising in her throat like bile. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of. She didn't belong here. She was going to mess everything up. She was going to breathe. Rosa's voice cut through the chaos in Eliza's head. She'd appeared beside the desk like an angel, her hand warm on Eliza's shoulder. Breathe, Rosa repeated. Then pick up the phone and tell them you'll connect them to Mr. Whitman's office. Don't try to solve the problem. Just connect them to someone who can. Eliza took a shaky breath and picked up the phone. Thank you for holding. I'll connect you to Mr. Whitman's office right away. The transfer worked. The people in suits were greeted and directed to the elevators. The world didn't end. But Eliza's hands were still shaking. I can't do this, she whispered to Rosa. Yes, you can, Rosa said firmly. You just did. You solved the problem. Maybe not the way you imagined, but you solved it. The rest of the week was a series of small disasters and smaller victories. Eliza misdirected calls and mixed up appointments and apologized so much it became a nervous tick. But she also learned the rhythm of the building, the names of regular visitors, the art of making people feel welcome even when she didn't know the answers to their questions. And slowly, something strange began to happen. People started to see her, not just as the cleaning girl who'd been promoted temporarily, as a person, someone with thoughts and opinions and the ability to help solve their problems. You're the one who helped me find my daughter's earring last week, one woman said. You crawled under that couch in the waiting area without even being asked. Thank you. You remembered my name, a delivery driver said, smiling. I've been coming here for 2 years, and you're the first person who's ever remembered my name. Small moments, tiny victories, but each one was like sunlight breaking through clouds. By Friday, Eliza was still nervous, still making mistakes, still apologizing too much. But she was also answering phones with confidence and greeting visitors with genuine warmth and solving problems she never could have imagined tackling a week before. That's when Claire showed up. It was late in the afternoon, and Eliza was alone at the desk again. She'd grown comfortable with the solitude, had even started to enjoy the quiet satisfaction of managing the lobby by herself. The elevator dinged, and Claire stepped out like she owned the building. Which, in a way, she thought she did. Eliza recognized her immediately. The woman from the BMW, the one who'd splashed mud on her uniform and laughed about it. But now, seeing her up close, what struck Eliza was how perfect everything about her was. The kind of perfection that required constant maintenance and never looked quite real. Claire approached the desk with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no about anything that mattered. "I need to see Joe," she announced, not bothering with pleasantries. "Mr. Whitman is in meetings this afternoon," Eliza said politely. "Would you like me to check his calendar and see when?" "Do you know who I am?" Claire interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Eliza's training kicked in. Sarah had prepared her for this. People who demanded to be recognized were usually the ones who needed recognition the most. "I'm sorry, I don't," Eliza said. "But I'd be happy to help you schedule an appointment with Mr. Whitman if you'd like to." Claire's laugh was the same one Eliza remembered from the parking lot. Cold and cutting and designed to make people feel small. "You're that girl," Claire said, recognition dawning in her eyes. "The cleaner. The one who got promoted to playing dress-up at the front desk." Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Can I help you with something, ma'am?" "You can help me by remembering your place," Claire said, leaning across the desk. "This little game Joe's playing? This isn't real. You're not real. You're just a charity case he picked up to make himself feel better about having money." Each word hit like a small slap, because part of Eliza had been thinking the same thing all week. Part of her had been waiting for someone to tell her she didn't belong, that this was all a mistake, that she should go back to her mop and her invisibility. But as Claire spoke, something unexpected happened. Eliza got angry. Not the kind of anger that exploded outward, but the quiet kind that burned steady and clean. The kind that came from finally seeing clearly. "Ma'am," Eliza said, her voice perfectly level, "Mr. Whitman is unavailable this afternoon. I'd be happy to take a message, or you can try calling his direct line." Claire's eyes flashed. "Listen to me, you little. Is there a problem here?" Rosa's voice cut through the tension like a blade. She'd appeared beside the desk again, but this time her pleasant smile had an edge that could cut diamonds. Claire straightened up, her mask of perfection sliding back into place. "Rosa," she said sweetly, "I was just trying to reach Joe, but your receptionist seems confused about who I am." "Oh, she knows exactly who you are," Rosa said, her smile never wavering. "Don't you, Eliza?" Eliza looked at Claire, really looked at her. Saw past the designer clothes and perfect makeup to the insecurity underneath. Saw someone who built herself up by tearing other people down. Someone whose entire sense of worth depended on making others feel worthless. Someone who was afraid that if she stopped being cruel, people might realize she wasn't as important as she pretended to be. "Yes," Eliza said quietly. "I do." Claire must have heard something in her voice, because her face went very still. "I'll call Joe directly," she said, turning on her expensive heels. As she walked away, Rosa leaned close to Eliza. "How do you feel?" she asked. Eliza thought about it. Really thought about it. For the first time in years, she felt like she mattered. Like she belonged somewhere. Like she was more than the sum of her circumstances. "Different," she said finally. "I feel different." Rosa smiled. "Good different or bad different?" Eliza watched Claire disappear into the elevator, then looked around the lobby she'd been managing all week. Her lobby, her desk, her job. "Good different," she said. "Definitely good different." But as Rosa walked away, leaving Eliza alone with her thoughts, neither of them realized that Claire's humiliation had just made her dangerous. And dangerous people, when they felt cornered, were capable of terrible things. The weight of kindness, Eliza was about to learn, was nothing compared to the weight of revenge. But that reckoning was still coming. For now, for this moment, Eliza Santos stood behind the reception desk of Blackstone Tower and felt, for the first time in her life, like she was exactly where she belonged. Revenge, Claire had learned long ago, was an art form. It wasn't enough to simply hurt someone. Any fool with a cruel tongue could do that. Real revenge required precision, strategy, the kind of calculated cruelty that destroyed people from the inside out while leaving your own hands perfectly clean. Claire Moreau had been practicing this art her entire life. In boarding school, she perfected the art of the anonymous complaint that got scholarship students expelled for behavioral issues. In college, she'd mastered the skill of social assassination, turning friend groups against each other with carefully planted whispers and stolen secrets. Now, watching some nobody cleaning girl play dress up at the front desk of her boyfriend's building, Claire felt that familiar itch. The need to restore the natural order. To remind people of their place in the hierarchy she'd spent her whole life climbing. Eliza Santos had made the mistake of looking Claire in the eye, of not backing down, of acting like she belonged in a world where people like her were meant to be invisible. That mistake was going to cost her everything. Claire spent 3 days planning, 3 days watching, learning Eliza's schedule, understanding the delicate ecosystem of the building that had given this girl her temporary moment of importance. The plan, when it finally came to her, was beautiful in its simplicity. HR complaints were anonymous. They had to be investigated. An investigation required suspension pending review. Company policy, no exceptions, no matter who was asking for leniency. All Claire needed was the right story. Something believable. Something that would stick. She found her inspiration watching Eliza handle a difficult visitor. A man whose appointment had been double booked, who was raising his voice and demanding to see someone important right now. Claire watched Eliza stand her ground, explain the situation calmly, offer solutions, and eventually defuse the situation with patience and grace. It was exactly the kind of professional competence that made Claire's teeth ache. But from the right angle, with the right spin, that same interaction could be painted very differently. Claire drafted the complaint on her laptop that night, sitting in her penthouse apartment with a glass of wine and the satisfied smile of someone who'd found the perfect weapon. To whom it may concern, I am writing to file a formal complaint regarding unprofessional and aggressive behavior by a staff member at the front desk. On Friday afternoon, I witnessed this employee, young Hispanic woman, approximately 5 feet 4 inches, working reception, become confrontational with a visitor who was simply trying to resolve a scheduling conflict. The employee raised her voice, became argumentative, and made the visitor visibly uncomfortable. When I attempted to intervene to help calm the situation, she was dismissive and rude to me as well. This behavior is completely unacceptable and reflects poorly on the company's standards. I am hesitant to come forward with this complaint because I fear retaliation, which is why I am submitting this anonymously. However, I felt it was my duty to report this behavior before it escalates further. Please investigate this matter promptly. A concerned observer. Claire read it over twice, making small adjustments to the tone. Not too dramatic. That would make it seem fake, but serious enough to trigger an automatic investigation. She printed it on generic paper, mailed it from a post office across town, and waited. The letter arrived at HR on a Tuesday morning. Jennifer Walsh, the HR director, read it with the weary resignation of someone who'd seen every kind of workplace drama imaginable. Anonymous complaints were the worst. Impossible to verify, difficult to investigate, but requiring the same thorough process as any other allegation. Company policy was clear. Any report of aggressive or unprofessional behavior had to be investigated, and the accused employee had to be suspended pending review. No exceptions, even for employees that everyone seemed to like. Especially for employees that everyone seemed to like. Jennifer had been watching the experiment with Eliza Santos with interest. The girl was clearly intelligent, clearly trying hard, and clearly making a good impression on both staff and visitors. But she was also clearly being fast-tracked in a way that raised questions. This complaint, anonymous or not, would have to be taken seriously. Jennifer made the call she dreaded making. Eliza, this is Jennifer from HR. I need you to come up to my office, please. Immediately, the walk from the reception desk to the HR office felt like a funeral march. Eliza's hands were shaking as she knocked on Jennifer's door, and the serious expression on the HR director's face told her everything she needed to know before anyone said a word. Sit down, please, Jennifer said gently. Eliza sat, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap, the same posture she'd learned during her first meeting with Mr. Whitman. The posture of someone prepared for the worst. Eliza, I've received a complaint about your behavior, Jennifer began. I want you to know that this is just an allegation, and we take all complaints seriously, but we also investigate them thoroughly before making any decisions. The words washed over Eliza like cold water. Complaint. Behavior. Investigation. I don't understand, she said quietly. What kind of complaint? Jennifer read the letter aloud, her voice carefully neutral. With each word, Eliza felt something inside her chest collapsing. Not breaking. That would have been cleaner. This was more like watching a building fall in on itself, floor by floor, until nothing was left but rubble. This isn't true, Eliza said when Jennifer finished. I never raised my voice. I never, her voice cracked. I've been so careful. I've tried so hard to do everything right. I believe you, Jennifer said, and the kindness in her voice somehow made it worse. But I have to follow protocol. You'll be suspended with pay pending our investigation. I'm sorry, suspended. The word echoed in Eliza's head as she cleaned out her temporary desk, gathered her few belongings, and walked past the reception area where Sarah was covering for her again. Suspended. Like she was dangerous. Like she was someone who couldn't be trusted around important people. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt like descending into a grave. Rosa found her there, standing by the security desk looking lost and small and utterly defeated. Sweetheart, what happened? Rosa asked, though one look at Eliza's face told her everything she needed to know. Someone complained about me, Eliza whispered. They said I was aggressive, unprofessional. They suspended me. Rosa's expression went very still. Who complained? They won't tell me. It was anonymous. Rosa felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach. In 15 years of working at Blackstone Tower, she'd learned to recognize the fingerprints of different kinds of cruelty. And this had Claire's signature all over it. This isn't over, Rosa said firmly. Do you hear me? This isn't how your story ends. But Eliza wasn't listening. She was remembering Claire's words from Friday afternoon. You're just a charity case he picked up to make himself feel better about having money. Maybe Claire was right. Maybe this whole thing had been a mistake. Maybe Eliza really didn't belong in a world where people wore suits that cost more than her family's rent and made decisions that changed lives with the casual indifference of God's moving chess pieces. I should go, she said. Rosa watched her walk away, shoulders slumped, head down, all the confidence she'd built over the past week crumbling with each step, and felt something ignite in her chest that hadn't burned this hot in years. 15 minutes later, Rosa was standing in Joe's office with the fury of a protective mother and the determination of someone who'd had enough. We need to talk, she said, closing the door behind her. Joe looked up from his computer, saw the expression on Rosa's face, and immediately gave her his full attention. What happened? Rosa told him everything. The complaint, the suspension, the look on Eliza's face as she walked away believing she'd failed at the one chance she'd ever been given. Joe listened in silence, his jaw getting tighter with each detail. Anonymous complaint, he said when Rosa finished. Anonymous complaint, she confirmed. About aggressive behavior. From the most gentle girl I've ever met. Joe stood up and walked to his window, looking down at the courtyard where this whole thing had started, where Claire had splashed mud on a stranger for the crime of existing in her line of sight. She knows, he said quietly. What? Claire knows I've been watching. Knows I care about what happens to Eliza. This isn't about protecting the company from a problem employee. Joe turned back to Rosa, and she saw something in his eyes that reminded her why he'd been successful in business. This is about punishing someone for threatening her position. Rosa felt a grim satisfaction at seeing Joe finally understand who he'd been sharing his bed with for 8 months. What are you going to do? She asked. Joe walked to his desk and picked up his phone. I'm going to end this, he said. Call HR, call Claire, and call Eliza. I want everyone in my office in 1 hour. Joe, 1 hour, Rosa. It's time to stop playing games. As Rosa left to make the calls, Joe stood alone in his office, looking out at the city he'd helped build, thinking about power and responsibility and the weight of decisions that changed people's lives. He'd spent 8 months choosing comfort over conscience, choosing easy over right, choosing the woman who made him feel important over the values that were supposed to make him be important. But some mistakes could still be fixed. Some stories could still be rewritten. And Joe Whitman was finally ready to be the hero of his own life, instead of just the villain in someone else's. The reckoning was coming. And this time, he wasn't going to look away. The executive conference room had never felt smaller. Joe sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, watching the most important people in Eliza Santos's professional life file in one by one. Jennifer from HR, clutching her folder of complaint documents. Rosa, radiating protective fury, and Eliza herself, looking like she was walking to her own execution. Claire was the last to arrive, sweeping in with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a battle that mattered to her. "Joe, darling," she said, leaning down to kiss his cheek. "What's this all about? I was supposed to meet my personal trainer in 20 minutes. Joe didn't return the kiss, didn't smile, didn't do any of the small performances that had kept their relationship running smoothly for 8 months. "Sit down, Claire," he said quietly. Something in his tone made her pause. She'd never heard that voice from him before, flat, careful, and absolutely final. Claire sat, her perfect smile faltering slightly. Joe looked around the table at these four women who represented the crossroads his life had reached. Jennifer, professional and neutral, trying to follow company policy. Rosa, fierce and loyal, ready to go to war for someone she'd grown to love. Eliza, quiet and wounded, believing she'd already lost everything that mattered. And Claire, beautiful and cruel, who'd built her entire identity on making sure people like Eliza remembered their place in her world. "I know who filed the complaint," Joe said without preamble. The silence that followed was deafening. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably. "Joe, the complaint was anonymous. I can't discuss." "I'm not asking you to discuss it," Joe said. "I'm telling you that I know who did it. And I know why." Claire's laugh was a little too bright, a little too sharp. "You sound very serious about some workplace drama. Honey, maybe we should." "Stop talking," Joe said, still looking at Eliza. "Just stop talking." Claire's mouth snapped shut. Joe reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Not the thin file that had summarized Eliza's work history in bullet points, but something thicker, more substantial. "Over the past week, I've been conducting my own investigation," he said. "Not into Eliza's behavior, into the pattern of complaints and incidents that seemed to follow certain people in this building." He opened the folder and began reading. Maria Gonzalez, housekeeping. Quit after 3 weeks. Exit interview cited hostile work environment, but didn't specify details. Joe looked up. "I called Maria. She told me about being humiliated by a woman in expensive clothes who demanded she re-clean an already spotless apartment 3 times, then complained to management that Maria was insolent when she asked if the work was satisfactory." Claire's face had gone very still. David Chun, valet at Romano's restaurant. Fired 6 months ago after a complaint about inappropriate behavior toward a customer. Joe turned a page. "I spoke to David. He told me about a woman who became enraged when he didn't recognize her from previous visits, who screamed at him in front of other customers, then claimed he'd made unwelcome comments." Jennifer was taking notes now, her professional calm beginning to crack. "Should I continue?" Joe asked, looking directly at Claire. "Because I have 12 more stories just like these. 12 people whose lives were disrupted because someone with money and influence decided their dignity was expendable." "You can't prove I had anything to do with," Claire started. "I have security footage," Joe said quietly. The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. "Footage of you leaving this building at 11:47 p.m. last Tuesday. Footage of you in the parking garage of the post office on 5th Street the next morning. Footage of you mailing an envelope." Claire's perfect composure finally cracked. "That doesn't prove anything." "You're right," Joe said. "It doesn't. But combined with witness testimony from Miguel about your comments regarding Eliza, and a handwriting analysis of the complaint letter that matches samples from notes you've left in my office." He closed the folder. "It paints a pretty clear picture." The silence stretched until it felt like a living thing. Finally, Eliza spoke. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never did anything to you. I never even spoke to you before Friday." Claire looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since this whole thing began. Saw not a threat or a symbol or a reminder of her own insecurities, but a person. A young woman who'd been trying to build something better for herself and had almost lost it because Claire couldn't bear to see someone rise above the place she'd assigned them in her head. "Because," Claire said, and for the first time in her adult life, she told the complete truth. "Because watching you succeed made me remember how much I hate myself." The honesty was so raw, so unexpected, that everyone in the room recoiled from it. "You were supposed to stay invisible," Claire continued, tears beginning to streak her makeup. "You were supposed to keep your head down and be grateful for whatever scraps you got. Because if people like you can just become people like us, then what does that make people like me? Joe felt something break apart in his chest. Not his heart, that had been breaking slowly for weeks. This was different. This was the sound of illusions shattering, of seeing clearly for the first time in months. It makes you exactly who you choose to be, he said softly. Nothing more. Nothing less. Claire looked around the table at the faces staring back at her. Professional disappointment, maternal protectiveness, quiet dignity, and something that might have been pity. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. I won't apologize, she said, her voice shaking. I won't pretend that this world is fair or that everyone deserves the same chances. Some of us had to fight for everything we have. So did she, Rosa said quietly, speaking for the first time since they'd sat down. The difference is, she fought without trying to destroy anyone else. Claire walked to the door, then turned back for one last look at Joe. You think you're saving her, she said. But you're just another rich man playing with poor people's lives because it makes you feel better about having money you didn't earn. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the end of something. Joe sat in the silence for a long moment, feeling the weight of Claire's parting shot. Because part of it was true, wasn't it? Part of this was about his own guilt, his own need to believe he was better than his circumstances suggested. But looking at Eliza, really looking at her, seeing the intelligence in her eyes and the strength in the way she held herself even now, even after everything, Joe realized something. This wasn't about him at all. This was about her. About potential that had been buried under other people's expectations. About dreams that had been deferred but not destroyed. About a young woman who deserved a chance to discover who she could become when the world wasn't constantly telling her to stay small. Eliza, he said, the complaint has been withdrawn. You're reinstated immediately. But that's not all, he continued before she could respond. I'd like to offer you a permanent position. Not temporary, not experimental. A real job with real opportunities for advancement. Eliza stared at him. I don't understand. We're creating a new position, Joe said. Executive assistant to the facilities management director. It would involve coordinating between different departments, managing projects, working directly with senior staff. The salary would be. He named a figure that made Eliza's eyes widen. Plus full benefits, education assistance, and a path to management training. Eliza's voice caught. I don't have the qualifications. You have something better, Rosa said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. You have heart, and intelligence, and the courage to keep trying even when the world tells you to quit. Jennifer cleared her throat. If you're interested in the position, Miss Santos, I can walk you through the paperwork this afternoon. Eliza looked around the table at these people who had fought for her, who had seen something in her that she was only beginning to see in herself. Yes, she said, and her voice was stronger now. Yes, I'm interested. 6 months later, Eliza Santos sat at her desk by the floor-to-ceiling window on the 32nd floor of Blackstone Tower, reviewing project reports and preparing for a meeting with department heads. Her desk was real mahogany, not pressed wood. Her computer was new, not a hand-me-down. Her business cards read Executive Assistant, Facilities Management, in elegant script that still made her smile every time she saw it. But the real change wasn't in the furniture or the title or the paycheck that let her family move to a better apartment and her brother see better doctors. The real change was in how she walked through the world now. Head up, shoulders back, taking up the space she'd learned she deserved. Her phone rang, and she answered with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. Eliza Santos, Facilities Management. Mija. Her mother's voice was warm with pride. You sound so professional. So grown up. Eliza smiled, looking out at the city spread below her window. How are you feeling, Mama? Happy, Maria said simply. You sound happy. And for the first time in her life, Eliza realized that she was. Not just content, not just grateful, but genuinely, completely happy. I have to go, she said. I'm meeting with Mr. Whitman in 10 minutes about the new employee mentorship program. Because that was the other thing that had changed. Eliza had proposed a program to identify and develop potential in employees who might otherwise be overlooked. People like her. People who just needed someone to see what they could become instead of just what they were. Joe had approved the program immediately. After she hung up, Eliza gathered her files and headed for the elevator. As the doors opened, She saw a young man in maintenance coveralls stepping off, someone new, someone she didn't recognize. He looked nervous, out of place, like he was worried someone would tell him he didn't belong. Eliza knew that look, had worn it herself not so long ago. "Excuse me," she said, and he looked up with the startled expression of someone who wasn't used to being addressed by people in business suits. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Eliza Santos. I don't think we've met." She extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, he shook it. "Carlos Ruiz," he said. "I just started in maintenance." "Welcome to Blackstone Tower, Carlos," Eliza said, and meant it. "If you ever need anything, questions, directions, someone to talk to, my office is on 32. Don't hesitate to reach out." As the elevator doors closed and carried her up toward her meeting with Joe, Eliza thought about circles. How cruelty created circles of pain that echoed through generations. But kindness could create circles too. Circles of opportunity and growth, and people lifting each other up instead of tearing each other down. She thought about Claire, who disappeared from their lives as completely as if she'd never existed. And she felt something she hadn't expected, not anger, but sadness. Sadness for someone who'd been so afraid of other people's success that she'd never learned to celebrate her own. But mostly, she thought about the future, about the mentorship program that would help people like Carlos see their own potential, about the night classes she was taking to earn her business degree, about the dreams she was finally brave enough to speak out loud. The elevator reached the 47th floor, and Eliza stepped out into Joe's reception area. Rosa was there, as always, and her face lit up when she saw Eliza approaching. "Ready to change the world?" Rosa asked. Eliza straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and smiled. "I already started," she said. And she had. One conversation at a time, one opportunity at a time, one person at a time. Because that's how the best stories really end. Not with grand gestures or perfect justice, but with ordinary people choosing to be kind. Choosing to see potential instead of limitations. Choosing to build bridges instead of walls. The glass doors of Blackstone Tower still opened automatically as Eliza walked through them each morning. But now they opened for someone who knew she belonged on both sides of them. Someone who understood that dignity isn't something you earn, it's something you're born with. And that understanding, that simple truth, changed everything. Not just for Eliza Santos, but for everyone whose life she would touch. That's the thing about kindness, it multiplies. And the best stories are the ones where everyone wins in the end. Even the people who almost lost everything along the way. Especially them.